Zora Neale Hurston was a literary giant and cultural anthropologist whose voice captured the essence of African American life in the early 20th century with unprecedented authenticity and power. Born on January 7, 1891, in Notasulga, Alabama, she would become one of the most important figures of the Harlem Renaissance, though her life was marked by both extraordinary achievement and profound struggle. Her journey from a small southern town to literary prominence and back to obscurity reveals the complexities of being a black woman artist in America. Hurston's early years were shaped by the unique environment of Eatonville, Florida, where her family moved when she was a toddler. Eatonville was one of the first all-black incorporated towns in the United States, and growing up there gave Hurston something rare for African Americans of her generation, a childhood largely free from the daily humiliations of Jim Crow segregation. In Eatonville, black people governed themselves, ran their own businesses, and created their own community institutions. This experience profoundly influenced Hurston's worldview and her later anthropological and literary work. Hurston's father, John Hurston, was a carpenter and Baptist preacher who served multiple terms as mayor of Eatonville. He was an ambitious man who wanted respectability and success. Her mother, Lucy Ann Potts Hurston, was a former school teacher who encouraged young Zora's imagination and spirit. Lucy told her daughter to jump at the sun, advice that Hurston would carry throughout her life. The relationship between her parents was complex, with her father's strictness often clashing with her mother's more nurturing approach. The defining tragedy of Hurston's childhood came in 1904 when her mother died. Zora was only 13 years old. Lucy's death devastated the family and marked the end of Hurston's secure childhood. Her father remarried quickly, and Hurston clashed with her stepmother. The family structure that had supported her collapsed. She was sent away to boarding school in Jacksonville, but when her father stopped paying the tuition, she was forced to leave. This began a period of wandering and hardship that would last for years. For nearly a decade, Hurston struggled to survive and continue her education. She worked as a maid, a waitress, and in various other jobs. She moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to establish roots. During this time, she developed the resilience and independence that would characterize her entire life. She also cultivated her skills as a storyteller and observer of human nature, talents that would serve her well in her future career. In 1917, at age 26, Hurston made a decision that would change her life. She lied about her age, claiming to be 16, and enrolled in Morgan Academy, the high school division of Morgan College in Baltimore. This deception about her age would persist throughout her life, with Hurston consistently claiming to be nearly a decade younger than she actually was. The reasons for this subterfuge were complex, involving both practical concerns about educational opportunities and deeper issues about how she wanted to present herself to the world. At Morgan Academy, Hurston excelled. She completed her high school education and then enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C., one of the nation's premier historically black colleges. At Howard, she studied under Alain Locke, the philosopher and critic who would become a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance. She also joined the Stylus, the university's literary club, and began publishing her first stories. Her work attracted attention for its authentic portrayal of black Southern life and its use of dialect. In 1925, Hurston moved to New York City, arriving just as the Harlem Renaissance was reaching its peak. This cultural movement saw an explosion of African American artistic achievement in literature, music, visual arts, and theater. Harlem had become the cultural capital of Black America, and young artists and intellectuals from across the country were drawn there. Hurston arrived with ambition, talent, and a distinctive personality that made her stand out even in that remarkable gathering of creative minds. Hurston quickly became a central figure in Harlem's literary scene. She was known for her wit, her storytelling ability, and her refusal to conform to others' expectations. While many Harlem Renaissance writers focused on the struggles of urban African Americans and the fight against racism, Hurston was more interested in celebrating black culture on its own terms. She wanted to show the richness, complexity, and beauty of black life, particularly in the rural South, without filtering it through the lens of white oppression or black respectability politics. In 1925, Hurston won second prize in the literary competition sponsored by Opportunity magazine for her story A Spunk. This recognition helped establish her reputation and brought her to the attention of important patrons and publishers. She also enrolled at Barnard College, the Women's College of Columbia University, where she was the only black student. At Barnard, she studied anthropology under Franz Boas, the pioneering anthropologist known as the father of American anthropology. Boas's influence on Hurston was profound. He encouraged her to apply scientific methods to the study of African American folklore and culture. He saw in Hurston a unique opportunity, a trained anthropologist who was also an insider to the culture she would study. Under Boas's guidance, Hurston began to see her background not as something to escape or apologize for but as a valuable resource for scholarly investigation. She graduated from Barnard in 1928 with a degree in anthropology. After graduation, Hurston received funding to conduct fieldwork in the South, collecting folklore, songs, stories, and cultural practices. She traveled through Florida, Alabama, and Louisiana, recording the oral traditions of black communities. This work was groundbreaking. While white folklorists had collected black folklore before, they often approached it as curiosity or evidence of primitiveness. Hurston, as both a trained anthropologist and a member of the culture she studied, brought unprecedented insight and respect to her work. Hurston's fieldwork was not without challenges. She had to navigate complex issues of insider and outsider status. Though she was black and from the South, her education and northern connection sometimes created distance between her and her subjects. She learned to adapt her presentation, sometimes emphasizing her roots in Eatonville, sometimes using her academic credentials, depending on the situation. Her ability to move between different worlds became one of her greatest strengths. In 1935, Hurston published Mules and Men, her first book of folklore. The work was revolutionary in its approach. Rather than simply presenting collected stories and songs, Hurston embedded them in narrative context, showing the social situations in which folklore was performed and the relationships between storytellers and audiences. She also included herself in the narrative, making the anthropologist's presence and perspective part of the story. The book received positive reviews and established Hurston as a serious scholar and writer. While conducting her anthropological work, Hurston continued to write fiction. In 1934, she published her first novel, Jonah's Good Vine, based loosely on the lives of her parents. The novel told the story of John Buddy Pearson, a charismatic preacher whose personal weaknesses undermine his public success. The book was well received and demonstrated Hurston's ability to create compelling narratives that captured the rhythms and language of black Southern life. Hurston's masterpiece came in 1937 with the publication of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Written in just 7 weeks while Hurston was in Haiti conducting anthropological research, the novel tells the story of Janie Crawford, a black woman in Florida who searches for love and self-realization through 3 marriages. The novel was revolutionary in its focus on a black woman's inner life and its use of black vernacular English as a literary language. Their Eyes Were Watching God was not immediately recognized as the masterpiece it is now considered. Some critics, particularly male African American intellectuals, attacked the novel. Richard Wright, the author of A Native Son, dismissed it as minstrelsy that pandered to white audiences' stereotypes about black people. Alain Locke criticized its lack of social consciousness. These critics wanted black literature to focus on racial oppression and the struggle for equality. They saw Hurston's celebration of black folk culture and her focus on personal rather than political themes as a betrayal of the race. Hurston refused to accept these criticisms. She believed that black life was worth portraying on its own terms, not just as a response to white racism. She wanted to show black people as complex human beings with rich inner lives, not just as victims or protesters. This philosophical difference would contribute to her marginalization in later years as the civil rights movement gained momentum and more overtly political literature became dominant. In 1938, Hurston published Tell My Horse, an account of her research into voodoo practices in Haiti and Jamaica. The book combined travelogue, anthropology, and personal narrative. It showed Hurston's fearlessness as a researcher. She had participated in voodoo ceremonies and investigated practices that other scholars only observed from a distance. The book received mixed reviews, with some critics questioning its scholarly rigor while others praised its vivid descriptions and insights. Hurston's next novel, Moses, Man of the Mountain, published in 1939, reimagined the biblical story of Moses through the lens of African American folklore and voodoo traditions. The novel was ambitious in its scope and its blending of different cultural traditions. It showed Hurston's continuing interest in exploring the connections between African, Caribbean, and African American cultures. However, like much of her work, it received limited commercial success. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, Hurston continued to work on various projects. She wrote plays, essays, and short stories. She conducted more anthropological fieldwork. She taught briefly at North Carolina College for Negroes. However, financial stability eluded her. Despite her productivity and talent, she struggled to earn a living from her writing. Publishers paid small advances, and her books, while critically respected, never became bestsellers. In 1942, Hurston published her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. The book was both revealing and evasive. Hurston shared stories from her childhood in Eatonville and her adventures as a young woman, but she obscured details about her age, her marriages, and her personal life. She also included controversial political opinions, some of which her publishers forced her to remove. The book won the Saturday Review's Anisfield Wolf Book Award for its contribution to race relations, but some readers felt it didn't adequately address racism and inequality. Hurston's final novel, Seraph on the Suwannee, published in 1948, was a departure from her earlier work. It focused on white characters in Florida, exploring themes of class, gender, and marriage. The novel showed Hurston's range as a writer, but it confused many readers and critics who expected her to write about black life. The book was not commercially successful, and it marked the beginning of Hurston's decline into obscurity. In 1948, Hurston faced a devastating personal crisis. She was falsely accused of molesting a 10-year-old boy. The charges were eventually dropped when it was proven that Hurston had been out of the country when the alleged incident occurred, but the accusation was deeply traumatic. The black press covered the story sensationally, and Hurston was humiliated. She contemplated suicide. Though vindicated, she never fully recovered from the emotional damage of the accusation. The 1950s were difficult years for Hurston. Her books went out of print. Publishers rejected her new manuscripts. The literary world that had once celebrated her had moved on to younger writers and different concerns. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and Hurston's individualistic, non-protest approach to black life seemed out of step with the times. She took various jobs to support herself, including working as a maid, a substitute teacher, and a librarian. Hurston's political views contributed to her marginalization. She opposed the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, arguing that it implied black schools were inferior and that integration was not necessarily the answer to educational inequality. She criticized the civil rights movement's focus on integration, believing that black people should develop their own institutions rather than seeking acceptance into white society. These views were deeply unpopular and further isolated her from the black intellectual community. Despite her struggles, Hurston continued to write. She worked on a biography of Herod the Great. She wrote articles for various publications. She remained intellectually engaged and curious about the world. However, her financial situation became increasingly desperate. She moved frequently, unable to afford stable housing. Her health began to decline. She suffered from various ailments, including stomach problems and hypertension. In 1956, Hurston took a job as a librarian at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. She also worked as a reporter for a local newspaper. These jobs provided some income but were far from the literary career she had once enjoyed. She lived in a small house and continued to write, though she had little hope of publication. Friends who visited her during this time reported that she remained intellectually sharp and maintained her sense of humor despite her circumstances. By 1959, Hurston's health had deteriorated significantly. She suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Unable to care for herself and with no family to help her, she was placed in the St. Lucie County Welfare Home, a facility for indigent residents. She spent her final months there, largely forgotten by the literary world that had once celebrated her. On January 28, 1960, Zora Neale Hurston died in the welfare home. She was 69 years old, though most people believed she was younger due to her lifelong deception about her age. The cause of death was listed as hypertensive heart disease. She died in poverty, and there was no money for a funeral or burial. The residents of Fort Pierce, Florida, where she had lived, raised money for a funeral. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Garden of Heavenly Rest, a segregated cemetery. For more than a decade after her death, Hurston remained largely forgotten. Her books were out of print. Scholars rarely mentioned her work. The civil rights movement and Black Power movement had little interest in a writer who had celebrated folk culture rather than protesting racism. It seemed that Hurston would be lost to history, another talented artist whose work had been overlooked and undervalued. Hurston's resurrection began in the early 1970s, thanks largely to the efforts of Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple. In 1973, Walker traveled to Florida searching for Hurston's grave. She found the unmarked plot in the overgrown cemetery and placed a headstone there, inscribed with the words Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South. Walker also wrote an influential essay, In Search of Zora Neale Hurston, published in Ms. Magazine in 1975, which introduced Hurston to a new generation of readers. Walker's advocacy sparked renewed interest in Hurston's work. Their Eyes Were Watching God was republished in 1978 and became a bestseller. Scholars began to re-examine Hurston's entire body of work, finding in it a richness and complexity that earlier critics had missed. Feminist scholars particularly embraced Hurston, seeing in Janie Crawford's Journey Toward Self-Realization a powerful statement about women's autonomy and voice. Today, Zora Neale Hurston is recognized as one of the most important American writers of the 20th century. Their Eyes Were Watching God is taught in high schools and universities across the country. Her anthropological work is valued for its insights into African American culture and its innovative methodology. Her life story has inspired biographies, documentaries, and scholarly studies. She has been honored with postage stamps, historical markers, and literary festivals. Hurston's legacy is complex and multifaceted. As a writer, she pioneered the use of Black vernacular English as a literary language, demonstrating that dialect could convey sophisticated ideas and deep emotions. As an anthropologist, she helped establish the study of African American folklore as a legitimate academic field. As a woman, she refused to conform to others' expectations, living independently and pursuing her ambitions in a time when such behavior was rare for women, especially Black women. Her insistence on portraying Black life on its own terms, without reference to white oppression, was both her greatest strength and the source of much criticism. In her time, many saw this approach as politically naive or even harmful. Today, scholars recognize it as a radical act of affirmation, a refusal to define Black existence solely through the lens of racism. Hurston believed that Black culture was valuable in itself, not just as a response to oppression, and her work celebrated that culture with joy and authenticity. Hurston's life also reveals the harsh realities faced by Black women artists in the 20th century. Despite her talent and productivity, she struggled financially throughout her life. Publishers paid her poorly, and her books never achieved the commercial success they deserved during her lifetime. She received little institutional support and had to constantly scramble for funding and opportunities. Her death in poverty in a welfare home stands as an indictment of a society that failed to value her contributions. Yet Hurston never became bitter or defeated. Those who knew her in her final years reported that she maintained her dignity, her humor, and her intellectual curiosity. She continued to write even when she had no prospect of publication. She remained engaged with ideas and committed to her vision of what literature could be. This resilience in the face of neglect and hardship is perhaps as important a part of her legacy as her literary achievements. Zora Neale Hurston was a woman of contradictions. She was a trained anthropologist who wrote like a novelist. She celebrated folk culture while pursuing academic credentials. She was politically conservative on some issues while being radically independent in her personal life. She claimed to be younger than she was while insisting on the importance of authentic truth-telling in literature. These contradictions made her difficult to categorize, which contributed both to her marginalization during her lifetime and to her enduring fascination for later generations. In the end, Hurston's greatest achievement was her voice, a voice that captured the rhythms, wisdom, and beauty of Black Southern life with unprecedented authenticity. She gave literary form to a culture that had been ignored or caricatured by mainstream literature. She created characters, especially Black women characters, who were fully human in their complexity, strength, and vulnerability. She showed that Black stories were universal stories, that the specific experiences of Black people in Eatonville, Florida, could speak to fundamental human truths about love, loss, identity, and belonging.